Hey dreamers, tonight we venture into a realm where darkness itself has hunger, where chaos wears the shape of ancient serpents, and where death is only the beginning of judgment. Have you ever wondered what lies beneath the gilded temples and sun-drenched deserts of ancient Egypt? Not the treasures buried in tombs or the glittering artifacts we see in museums, but something far more profound, the unseen landscape of the dead? The Egyptians mapped it. They recorded it. They feared it. And within those dark passages, through those shadowed corridors of the afterlife, there dwell creatures so terrible that the very gods themselves must wage eternal war to keep them at bay. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy my work here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you now. Tonight, we speak of two beings who command the Egyptian underworld, two forces that every soul who ever died would need to reckon with. We speak of Apophis, the serpent of chaos itself, and Ammit, the devourer of hearts. But first, you must understand the stage upon which these creatures play. You must understand the Duat. The Duat, it means hidden place. It is not a dungeon. It is not the fiery pit of torment that later religions would imagine. The ancient Egyptians saw it as a mirror of their own world, a place with rivers and lakes, fields and mountains. But in the Duat, everything exists in paradox. Water burns. Light dwells in absolute darkness. The living and the dead walk the same paths, yet they see entirely different landscapes. The Duat is Egypt, yet not Egypt. It is the shadow of reality, the necessary inverse of creation itself. Through the Duat flows a river, a subterranean reflection of the Nile. But this is no peaceful stream. Along its banks lie fields of fire, temples guarded by beings of immeasurable strangeness, and gates sealed by words of power. To pass through the Duat is to pass through 12 hours, 12 regions, each more perilous than the last. And moving through these waters each and every night is Ra, the sun god himself, in his sacred boat called the Messengers, the evening bark. This is where our story begins. Each night, without fail, without mercy, this cosmic journey repeats. Ra descends into the underworld as the sun touches the western horizon. His boat sinks below the edge of the world. And somewhere in that darkness, waiting with the hunger of eternity, lies Apophis. Apophis, the name itself, was spoken in whispers, if it was spoken at all. To speak the name was to risk attracting the attention of that which you did not wish to attract. The Egyptians understood something that many modern people forget. Words have power. Names have weight. And Apophis was known by many names. Apep, Apepi, sometimes called he who was spat out, as if this creature had been born not from the divine will, but from cosmic rejection, vomited into being by the goddess Neith herself, from the very waters of chaos that existed before creation. How fitting, truly a creature born of rejection, forever seeking to unmake the world that rejected it. Imagine a serpent, but cast away the limits of what serpents can be. Imagine a creature that is part serpent, part dragon, part pure abstraction of darkness given form. Some texts describe Apophis as being over 50 feet in length, longer than a riverboat, heavier than a temple. His scales were said to be as hard as flint, impossible to pierce with any ordinary weapon. His eyes glowed red like embers in an endless night, and within his throat resided a venom, not the poison of natural snakes, but something far more sinister, the venom of chaos itself, capable of dissolving the very threads that hold reality together. Apophis lived in the waters of the Duat, coiled in the darkness, waiting. But waiting is not the right word, because it implies patience, and Apophis possessed no patience. He existed in a state of constant hunger, a hunger that could never be satisfied, because the thing he craved most was the complete annihilation of creation. To swallow Ra, to devour the sun itself, to plunge the cosmos into eternal night and allow chaos to reign supreme, nothing less would satisfy him. The ancient Egyptians believed that Apophis had existed since the very beginning of time, since before Ra had brought order to the cosmos. In the primordial moment, before creation itself, there was only chaos, a vast, undifferentiated ocean called the Nun, From this chaos, creation emerged. But Apophis was the chaos that remained. He was the order's eternal rival, the thing that stood outside creation, perpetually seeking to undo it. Honestly, which concept terrifies you more, the idea of being destroyed, or the idea that you were never truly safe to begin with, that chaos is always waiting just beyond the edges of your world? For me, it has to be that second one. It means that everything we build, everything we treasure, everything we think is solid and real, is actually just a temporary arrangement. Apophis understood this. He embodied it. Every night, as Ra sailed into the underworld, the serpent would strike. Sometimes Apophis would emerge from the waters with his mouth agape, attempting to swallow the entire solar barque in one catastrophic gulp. The boat would be seized in his terrible coils, wrapped and crushed by muscles that had been coiling and tightening since before humanity had a name. At other times, Apophis would use a weapon far more subtle and far more dangerous. He would hypnotize Ra with a gaze so intense, so compelling, that the sun god and all his crew would fall into a trance. They would forget their purpose. They would forget which direction they were sailing. They would simply stop, suspended in time and place, while Apophis circled them slowly, preparing for the kill. But Ra did not travel alone. He could not have. Even a god of his immense power could not have defeated Apophis night after night, eternally, without aid. And so Ra's boat was crewed by a retinue of divine protectors. There was Set, the god of storms and chaos. Ironic, perhaps, that a god associated with chaos would defend against chaos. But Set served a higher principle, the maintenance of order, even when it meant defending the very sun that had often brought him shame and rejection. Set stood at the prow of the boat with a great spear. When Apophis struck, Set would be there to meet him, thrusting his weapon into the serpent's side, driving him back, forcing him to coil and retreat. Hey dreamers, tonight we venture into a realm where darkness itself has hunger, where chaos wears the shape of ancient serpents, and where death is only the beginning of judgment. Have you ever wondered what lies beneath the gilded temples and sun-drenched deserts of ancient Egypt? Not the treasures buried in tombs or the glittering artifacts we see in museums, but something far more profound, the unseen landscape of the dead. The Egyptians mapped it. They recorded it. They feared it. And within those dark passages, through those shadowed corridors of the afterlife, there dwell creatures so terrible that the very gods themselves must wage eternal war to keep them at bay. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy my work here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you now. Tonight we speak of two beings who command the Egyptian underworld, two forces that every soul who ever died would need to reckon with. We speak of Apophis, the serpent of chaos itself, and Ammit, the devourer of hearts. But first you must understand the stage upon which these creatures play. You must understand the Duat. The Duati means hidden place. It is not a dungeon, it is not the fiery pit of torment that later religions would imagine. The Duat is something far more intricate, far more alive with meaning. The ancient Egyptians saw it as a mirror of their own world, a place with rivers and lakes, fields and mountains. But in the Duat, everything exists in paradox. Water burns, light dwells in absolute darkness. The living and the dead walk the same paths, yet they see entirely different landscapes. The Duat is Egypt, yet not Egypt. It is the shadow of reality, the necessary inverse of creation itself. Through the Duat flows a river, a subterranean reflection of the Nile. But this is no peaceful stream. Along its banks lie fields of fire, temples guarded by beings of immeasurable strangeness, and gates sealed by words of power. To pass through the Duat is to pass through 12 hours, 12 regions, each more perilous than the last. And moving through these waters each and every night is Ra, the sun god himself, in his sacred boat called the Messengers, the evening barque. This is where our story begins. Each night, without fail, without mercy, This cosmic journey repeats. Ra descends into the underworld as the sun touches the western horizon. His boat sinks below the edge of the world, and somewhere in that darkness, waiting with the hunger of eternity, lies Apophis. Apophis. The name itself was spoken in whispers, if it was spoken at all. To speak the name was to risk attracting the attention of that which you did not wish to attract. The Egyptians understood something that many modern people forget. Words have power. Names have weight. And Apophis was known by many names. Apep, Apep. Sometimes called he who was spat out, as if this creature had been born not from the divine will, but from cosmic rejection, vomited into being by the goddess Neith herself from the very waters of chaos that existed before creation. How fitting, truly, a creature born of rejection, forever seeking to unmake the world that rejected it. Imagine a serpent, but cast away the limits of what serpents can be. Imagine a creature that is part serpent, part dragon, part pure abstraction of darkness given form. Some texts describe Apophis as being over 50 feet in length, longer than a riverboat, heavier than a temple. His scales were said to be as hard as flint, impossible to pierce with any ordinary weapon. His eyes glowed red like embers in an endless night. And within his throat resided a venom, not the poison of natural snakes, but something far more sinister, the venom of chaos itself, capable of dissolving the very threads that hold reality together. Apophis lived in the waters of the Duat, coiled in the darkness, waiting. But waiting is not the right word, because it implies patience, and Apophis possessed no patience. He existed in a state of constant hunger, a hunger that could never be satisfied, because the thing he craved most was the complete annihilation of creation. To swallow Ra, to devour the sun itself, to plunge the cosmos into eternal night and allow chaos to reign supreme. Nothing less would satisfy him. The ancient Egyptians believed that Apophis had existed since the very beginning of time, since before Ra had brought order to the cosmos. In the primordial moment, before creation itself, there was only chaos, a vast, undifferentiated ocean called the None. From this chaos, creation emerged, but Apophis was the chaos that remained. He was the order's eternal rival, the thing that stood outside creation, perpetually seeking to undo it. Honestly, which concept terrifies you more? The idea of being destroyed, or the idea that you were never truly safe to begin with? That chaos is always waiting just beyond the edges of your world. For me, it has to be that second one. It means that everything we build, everything we treasure, everything we think is solid and real, is actually just a temporary arrangement. Apophis understood this. He embodied it. Every night, as Ra sailed into the underworld, the serpent would strike. Sometimes Apophis would emerge from the waters with his mouth agape, attempting to swallow the entire solar bark in one catastrophic gulp. The boat would be seized in his terrible coils, wrapped and crushed by muscles that had been coiling and tightening since before humanity had a name. At other times, Apophis would use a weapon far more subtle and far more dangerous. He would hypnotize Ra with a gaze so intense, so compelling, that the sun god and all his crew would fall into a trance. They would forget their purpose. They would forget which direction they were sailing. They would simply stop, suspended in time and place, while Apophis circled them slowly, preparing for the kill. But Ra did not travel alone. He could not have. Even a god of his immense power could not have defeated Apophis night after night, eternally, without aid. And so Ra's boat was crewed by a retinue of divine protectors. There was Set, the god of storms and chaos. Ironic, perhaps, that a god associated with chaos would defend against chaos, but Set served a higher principle, the maintenance of order, even when it meant defending the very sun that had often brought him shame and rejection. Set stood at the prow of the boat with a great spear. When Apophis struck, Set would be there to meet him, thrusting his weapon into the serpent's side, driving him back, forcing him to coil and retreat. Pedius, Minimax, and Isis was there as well, the great goddess of magic. When Apophis tried to use his hypnotic powers, Isis would counter with her own sorceries, protecting Ra's mind, anchoring him to purpose. Horus, the falcon-headed son of Osiris, would scout ahead, warning of the serpent's movements. Mehin, a serpent himself, a protector serpent, a force for order wearing the shape of chaos, would coil around Ra's boat, a living shield against the assault. And then there were the spells. The ancient Egyptians composed hymns of power, incantations meant to bind Apophis, to wound him, to weaken his resolve. These spells were not metaphorical. The Egyptians believed them to be genuinely effective, real weapons in a real war. Priests would recite them each night, adding their voices to the chorus of divine voices protecting Ra. The Book of the Dead itself contained spells against Apophis. The coffin texts were filled with them. These were not bedtime stories meant to soothe the living. They were military strategy. They were the ancient Egyptians literally collaborating with the gods to keep the sun rising each morning. What strikes you most about that approach to spirituality? That the success of the cosmos itself depended partially on human participation? For me, it's the sense of shared responsibility, that you were never merely a passive observer of reality, but a necessary participant in its survival. That's either incredibly empowering or absolutely terrifying, depending on your point of view. Yet Apophis could never be permanently defeated. This is crucial to understanding the Egyptian worldview. He could be wounded, he could be driven back, but he could not be killed. The evil he represented, chaos, darkness, the principle of uncreation, was eternal and necessary. For there to be order, there must be something opposed to order. For there to be creation, there must be the possibility of destruction. These are not opposites fighting to the death. They are two forces locked in an eternal dance, neither able to fully vanquish the other. So Ra's journey through the Duat was not a journey toward victory, but a journey toward survival. Each night's passage through the 12 hours of darkness was a renewed struggle, a reminder that triumph was never assured, that the sun would indeed rise tomorrow, but only because it rose today, and the day before that, and the day before that. The Egyptians understood entropy in a way that would not be formalized until thousands of years later. They knew that order requires constant effort. Chaos is the default state. After those 12 hours, each one an ordeal, each one a battle, Ra would reach the eastern horizon. The serpent would be driven back, or, more accurately, would withdraw into the depths, sated for the moment, waiting for nightfall to come around again. Ra would transform. As his boat surfaced from the underworld, he would shed his ram-headed form and take the shape of Khepri, the scarab beetle, the symbol of resurrection and renewal. He would emerge from the waters and climb into the sky as the morning sun, bringing light to the world once more. The Egyptians would greet this dawn with hymns and prayers, farmers would return to their fields, children would play in the streets, merchants would open their shops. And all of it was a continuation of a war that had been raging since before time itself. A war that the ordinary person rarely recognized, but that was absolutely essential to their existence. Without Ra's victory each night, there would be no harvest, no children, no world. But the journey through the Duat was not Ra's journey alone. Though Ra's story is the most dramatic, the most central to the cosmic order, every human soul also had to travel through the underworld. Every soul had to pass through the gates. Every soul had to encounter the beings who dwelt there, and not all of those encounters ended in survival. After a person died, Their soul, their ka or their ba, depending on which aspect of the self we're discussing, would be guided by Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification and the dead, into the Duat. This was not an instant transition. The journey took time. The soul would encounter obstacles. It would face guardians at each of the 12 gates, beings with names like He Who Drinks Blood and She Who Sits in Darkness. The soul would have to know these names. To know a being's true name was to have power over them, or at least to be granted safe passage. This is why the Book of the Dead was called the Book of Going Forth by Day. It was literally a guidebook, a manual for how to navigate the underworld successfully and emerge into the eternal paradise known as the Field of Reeds. But here is where we meet our second protagonist, or antagonist, depending on your perspective. After all these trials, after the soul had successfully traversed the perils of the Duat and survived its guardians, there came the ultimate judgment. There came the moment where one's entire existence was weighed and measured against a single standard, and presiding over this judgment was Ammit. Ammit does not inspire the epic poetry that Apophis does. She does not command armies or wage cosmic war. She is not the enemy of gods. And yet, and this is what makes her so fascinating, she is perhaps the more terrifying figure for an individual soul to face. Because while Apophis represents the chaos that threatens creation itself, Ammit represents something far more personal, the consequence of how you have lived. She is justice, she is punishment, she is the final and irrevocable verdict. The name Ammit means devourer or eater. She is often called the devourer of the dead, or more specifically, the eater of hearts. Her appearance was designed to be absolutely unmistakable and absolutely terrifying. Imagine the 3 largest, most dangerous predators known to the ancient Egyptians. Take the massive head of a crocodile, with its gaping jaws and cruel ancient eyes. Place this on the muscular body of a lion, an apex predator whose very roar could freeze prey in place, and then give this creature the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, not for any naturalistic reason, but because hippopotami in the Nile were massive, unpredictable, and incredibly dangerous. The result is a chimera, unlike anything in the natural world, a composite beast that embodied the predatory power of Egypt's most fearsome animals. Ammit was not worshipped. There were no temples dedicated to her. No priests spoke prayers to her. No common people wore amulets bearing her likeness for protection. And this was entirely intentional. She was feared, yes, but fear and worship are not the same thing. Ammit did not ask for devotion because she did not need it. She did not seek followers or offerings because she was not a being who could be negotiated with or appeased. She was as inevitable as death itself. She was the law of the universe written in flesh and hunger. While Apophis waited in the waters of the Duat, constantly scheming to devour Ra, Ammit waited in a different place, in the Hall of Judgment, the Hall of Truth, also called the Hall of Two Truths. This was not a place of torture or active malevolence. It was a place of perfect, impartial justice. The Hall of Judgment was presided over by Osiris, the great god of the dead, the one who had himself been murdered and resurrected, who knew both death and restoration. Osiris sat upon a throne of judgment, flanked by his divine court. Beside him stood Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, who kept records of all knowledge and all judgment. And before Osiris stood Ma'at, not in human form, but represented by a single ostrich feather, the very symbol of truth and balance. When a deceased soul arrived at the Hall of Judgment, they were brought forward by Anubis. The moment had come, the moment every Egyptian dreaded and yet tried to prepare for throughout their entire life. The soul would face Osiris. They would recite what is called the negative confession, a list of 42 sins that they had not committed during their lifetime. They would declare themselves innocent of murder, innocent of theft, innocent of adultery, innocent of lies, innocent of betrayal, innocent of 42 specific transgressions, each representing some violation of Ma'at, the principle of cosmic order, truth, and justice. But here is the thing, and here is where Ammit becomes relevant in a way that is simultaneously reassuring and horrifying. The heart cannot lie. Even if the soul speaks falsely, their heart, which the Egyptians understood to be the seat of memory, conscience, and truthfulness, cannot speak falsehoods. The heart remembers. The heart knows what it did. Do you ever wish you could lie about who you are and have that lie accepted? For me, I think the scariest part of the Egyptian system is that they didn't believe such a lie was possible. Your deeds would be known. Your heart would testify. There was no hiding, no escaping, no final deception that could save you. Anubis would take the heart of the deceased and place it on one side of an immense golden scale. The scale was magical, ancient, imbued with divine power. On the other side of the scale, Thoth would place something almost mundane in its simplicity. The feather of Ma'at. A single feather. But this was the heaviest possible standard against which a human life could be measured. As the two sides of the scale were balanced, the entire court watched in silence. The 42 assessors of Ma'at, minor deities and beings of divine authority, all looked on. The other souls waiting for judgment watched. The gods themselves held their breath. If the heart was light, if it balanced evenly with Ma'at's feather, then the soul had lived well. They were declared true of voice. They had embodied Ma'at throughout their life. They had told the truth. They had been honest in business. They had treated their family with respect. They had obeyed the laws. They had upheld the cosmic order. For them, the field of reeds awaited. A paradise that was not so different from the life they had lived on earth, but perfected, eternal, free from suffering and pain. But if the heart was heavy, if it sank down on the scale, weighed down by the burden of wrongdoing, then something else happened. The heart would be cast aside, it would be tossed to the ground. And Ammit, who had been sitting quietly beside the scales, patient and motionless as stone, would rise up and move forward. There would be a sound, perhaps a sound like massive jaws snapping shut, perhaps a sound like something being consumed entirely, and the unworthy soul would simply cease to exist. This is crucial to understand. It was not torture. It was not eternal punishment or torment. It was obliteration. Complete and utter non-existence. No afterlife. No journey to any realm. No continuation of consciousness. The soul was simply eaten, digested into nothingness, and voided from existence as thoroughly as a drop of water might evaporate in the desert sun. This was the second death. This was the absolute end. For an ancient Egyptian, this was the ultimate horror. Not suffering, but the complete negation of eternal life. The Egyptians saw the afterlife not as reward or punishment in the way later religions would conceive of them, but as natural consequences. If you lived truthfully, your life would be light. If you lived falsely, your life would be heavy. Ammit did not judge. Ammit simply enforced the natural laws of the cosmos. She was neutral, in a way. She did not choose who to devour. She simply ate what was unworthy, just as the Nile floods in season, just as the sun rises in the morning, just as the stars follow their prescribed paths. And yet, and this is where it becomes complex, where morality in ancient Egypt becomes surprisingly nuanced, Ammit could be merciful. If you were clever, if you possessed the proper magical knowledge, you could strengthen your heart. The Book of the Dead contained a spell specifically designed to prevent your heart from testifying against you. You could recite words of power that would make your heart light, regardless of your actual deeds. You could overcome Ammut's judgment through wisdom and preparation. This reveals something essential about the Egyptian relationship with spirituality and death. They were pragmatists. They believed in the cosmic order, but they also believed in strategy, in preparation, in the use of knowledge as a shield against the vagaries of existence. The gods could help you, yes, but they could also be outwitted. The afterlife could be gained through virtue, certainly, but also through cunning and the right preparation. Life was a negotiation between the living and the dead, between humans and gods, between order and chaos. Ammut never left the Hall of Judgment. While Apophis roamed the waters of the Duat, scheming and attacking, Ammut remained still, waiting. She was not evil, but she was inexorable. She was not cruel, but she was unforgiving. She represented a kind of justice that we in the modern world have largely abandoned. She was the consequence made flesh. She was the idea that some things cannot be redeemed, some lines once crossed cannot be uncrossed. The ancient Egyptians lived in the shadow of Ammut. Every choice mattered because Ammut would remember it. Every action had weight because Ammut would weigh it. Every lie told, every theft committed, every betrayal enacted would make the heart heavier, would bring you closer to the moment when Ammut would rise and move towards you. And perhaps this was the true brilliance of the Egyptian mythology. While we in the modern day try to create external systems of law to compel virtue, police forces and prisons and punishment systems, the Egyptians internalized the law. They made virtue not something imposed from outside, but something that you carried within you, in the very organ that made you human. Your heart was your judge, your deeds were your judgment, and Ammut was simply the inevitable consequence of truth finally speaking. So when we speak of the demons and monsters of the Egyptian underworld, we must recognize that they are not simply obstacles to be overcome, not merely obstacles in a narrative journey. They are mirrors held up to creation itself. Apophis is the chaos that dwells at the heart of existence, the eternal reminder that order is not inevitable, that the universe could collapse into night. Ammut is the consequence written into the fabric of creation, the reminder that actions matter, that truth will ultimately be known, that we cannot escape the weight of what we have done. The Egyptians understood something profound that many modern people have forgotten, that fear can be a teacher, that monsters can contain wisdom, that the things which terrify us most often point toward the principles that matter most in our lives. They mapped the underworld not to escape it, but to know it, to understand it, and by understanding it, to be better prepared to face it when their time came. The night is long, dreamers, and the underworld is vast. But now you know at least part of what lies beneath the world. Now you understand at least two of the beings who dwell in those hidden places. And perhaps that knowledge will help you, as it helped the ancient Egyptians, to see the invisible forces that shape existence, the chaos that can never be fully defeated, and the justice that can never be escaped. But our journey is far from over. There are other creatures dwelling in the Duat, there are other horrors and wonders waiting to be discovered, there are other beings worthy of study and contemplation, but those stories, dreamers, must wait for another night. For tonight we rest in the shadow of the serpent and the devourer, knowing that somewhere beneath the world the eternal struggle continues. Ra sailing ever forward, Apophis ever circling, Ammut ever waiting, and justice, inevitable and eternal, weighing the hearts of all who come before it. But there is another layer to this underworld, dreamers, another dimension of threat and challenge that we have not yet fully explored. For Ra does not simply encounter Apophis and then reach the Hall of Judgment where Ammut waits. The journey is far more complex than that. The path through the Duat is not open. It is not a simple corridor through darkness. The underworld is partitioned. It is structured. It is defended. And standing at every threshold, At every crucial juncture between one realm and the next are beings whose sole purpose is to prevent passage, the Gate Guardians. These are not merely obstacles, they are not simple enemies to be defeated. They are, in many ways, the true test of the Egyptian afterlife journey. Because while Apophis represents the cosmic threat, the existential danger to creation itself, the Gate Guardians represent something more personal, more intimate, and in many ways more terrifying. They are the enforcers of divine law. They are the gatekeepers who determine whether you belong in the next chamber or whether your journey ends before it truly begins. The ancient Egyptians understood the Duat not as a single vast cavern or a simple linear pathway, but as a realm divided into 12 distinct regions, 12 hours corresponding to the 12 hours of night. And between each of these hours stood a gate. Some texts describe these gates as massive architectural structures, pylons of stone as tall as temples, their doors sealed with words of power. Other texts describe them as living entities, as goddesses in their own right, their very essence forming a barrier between worlds. But whether they were made of stone or divine substance, whether they were places or beings or both at once, the gates served a singular purpose. They separated the worthy from the unworthy, the prepared from the unprepared, the truthful from the false. Each gate was not defended by a single guardian. No, that would be far too simple. Each gate was guarded by a trinity of beings, a complex arrangement that reflected the Egyptian understanding of divine order and the multiplicity of forces required to maintain cosmic balance. At each gate stood 3 entities: a guardian god who wielded absolute authority over passage, a doorkeeper whose role was to announce who came seeking entrance, and a herald who proclaimed the consequences of refusal. Their names, and this is crucial to understanding the system, their names were fearful things, carefully crafted to inspire terror and convey the precise nature of the threat they represented. The guardian at one gate was called He Who Cleansed the Sky. The doorkeeper there bore the title One Who Sees All. The herald at that same gate was known as Rejecter of Rebels. Each name was a warning, each name contained information about what awaited those who sought to pass. And here is where we must understand something essential about the Egyptian concept of power and knowledge. These names were not mere labels, they were not arbitrary identifications. In ancient Egyptian thinking, a name contained the essence of the thing named. To know a being's true name was to possess power over that being. Or more precisely, to know the name was to demonstrate that you had been properly initiated, properly educated, properly prepared. A soul arriving at a gate without knowledge of these names was immediately revealed as unprepared, as someone who had not lived a life worthy of the afterlife, who had not devoted themselves to understanding the sacred mysteries, who had not earned the right to pass through. This created a system both elegant and brutal. The Gate Guardians did not need to test you physically. They did not need to demand that you prove your strength or your courage. Instead, they asked you a simple question: what is my name? And if you could not answer, if the knowledge had not been burned into your memory during your lifetime, then you could not pass. Your journey ended there. Or, more accurately, your journey continued, but it continued backward, away from the field of reeds, away from any hope of eternal life. Some texts suggest that those who could not name the guardians would be turned away to wander the Duat endlessly. Others suggest something darker, that failure to name the guardians was itself a form of judgment, a revelation that your heart was already unworthy, and you would be handed over immediately to Ammit without even reaching the Hall of Judgment. Consider the terror of this system for a moment. Throughout your entire life, you lived under the shadow of potential knowledge, the knowledge that your entire afterlife depended upon memorizing and retaining information that seemed, During your living years, almost abstract, almost unimportant, the priests would teach you the names of the guardians. The scribes would copy them into the book of the dead, the book meant to go forth by day with you into your tomb. Your family would recite them during burial ceremonies. And all of this was not superstition. All of this was preparation. All of this was genuine. The Egyptians understood that knowledge itself was a form of power, that preparation was itself a form of prayer, that remembrance was itself a form of devotion. Let us speak now of the gods themselves and what we know of their characteristics. The ancient Egyptians were remarkably specific in their descriptions. They did not speak in vague abstractions or poetic metaphors. They drew pictures, they wrote names, they listed descriptions, and what emerges from these records is a pantheon of beings who were not entirely evil, but were entirely impartial. They did not hate the deceased. They did not seek to torment them for sport, but neither would they show mercy, neither would they bend the rules. They were in essence the embodiment of the law itself, law given form, given agency, given terrible authority. At one gate stood a guardian described in the tomb inscriptions as "he who eats the putrefaction," a being whose very name suggested a creature of absolute revulsion, something that fed on decay and corruption. And yet this guardian represented something profound, the principle of purification through consumption, the idea that corruption must be confronted and consumed, must be removed entirely from the sacred space. Another guardian bore the name the One Who Roars, described as a creature of terrifying power and immense ferocity, whose voice alone could shake the foundations of the underworld. This guardian represented the power of divine will, the force of cosmic law spoken aloud with such authority that it could not be disobeyed or questioned. The demons and deities who served as gate guardians were typically depicted as hybrid creatures, combinations of the most dangerous animals known to the ancient Egyptians. Some had the heads of crocodiles, the bodies of lions, the hindquarters of hippopotami, much like Ammit herself, though with different specific combinations and different fearsome characteristics. Others were described as having the heads of serpents or vultures or jackals. There was a profound logic to these hybrid forms. They were not meant to be naturalistic. They were not meant to look like anything that actually existed in the world. They were meant to be alien. They were meant to be absolutely clear in their otherness, their fundamental difference from anything living or natural. This was deliberate. The gate guardians were not creatures of the world of the living. They were not meant to be understood or reasoned with in ordinary ways. They were forces of the underworld, ancient, primordial, absolutely committed to their function. But here is what makes the Gate Guardian system particularly fascinating from a spiritual and philosophical perspective. The Guardians could not be defeated through ordinary means. You could not fight them. You could not outwit them through cleverness or trickery. You could not bargain with them or appeal to their mercy because they had none. The only way to pass a Gate Guardian was to satisfy the requirements of the gate. And the requirements were always the same. Demonstrate knowledge through naming, demonstrate worthiness through understanding, demonstrate preparation through having lived a life that warranted this knowledge. For those who succeeded, for those who spoke the correct names and demonstrated their worthiness, the gates would simply open. The guardian would acknowledge the passage as appropriate and would step aside. And this is a remarkable concept when you think about it. The gate guardian's role was not to obstruct the worthy, but to filter, to separate those who had prepared themselves from those who had not. To refuse passage to the unprepared was, in essence, to reveal them as unworthy. To grant passage to those with knowledge was to confirm that they had lived correctly, had studied correctly, had dedicated themselves to understanding the sacred mysteries. The gate, in this sense, became not a barrier, but a mirror. It reflected back to you whether you had lived the life you should have lived. There were, according to various texts, anywhere from 7 gates to 21 gates to over 1,000 gates, depending on which funerary text we consult. This multiplicity is not a contradiction. It is instead a reflection of the Egyptian understanding that there were many ways to describe the underworld, many levels at which one could perceive and organize it. A brief textual description might reference 7 major gates, the primary thresholds through which any soul must pass. A more elaborate description, such as those found painted on the walls of royal tombs, might describe 12 gates corresponding to the 12 hours of night. And the most esoteric texts, the ones meant only for the most advanced priests and the most prepared souls, might describe dozens of gates, hundreds of gates, each one representing a subtle shift in spiritual state, each one a threshold between different levels of existence and understanding. The Book of Gates, one of the most important funerary texts discovered in the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, provides extraordinarily specific descriptions of these gates and their guardians. It describes Ra's boat travelling through each gate in succession. At the second gate stood a guardian called the Swallower of Sinners, a name that carries obvious implications. This creature was described as being positioned before a lake of fire, a barrier of burning water that would consume any soul foolish enough to attempt passage without proper knowledge and preparation. At the third gate stood a serpent called Stinger, and the gate itself was personified as the goddess Mistress of Food, a being who controlled access to the sustenance necessary for continued existence in the afterlife. This gate protected a sacred lake called the Lake of Life, a body of water forbidden to the dead because it was the place where Ra himself drew his breath, where the sun god maintained his vitality. The guardians at different gates embodied different aspects of the trial. Some represented physical danger, pure, immense, undeniable threat. Others represented moral judgment. Still others represented intellectual challenges or spiritual tests that could only be passed through proper knowledge or magical skill. One guardian bore a name that translated approximately as "he with alert heart," a being that was not designed to fight, but to observe, to judge, to determine the true nature of what stood before it. To pass this guardian required not strength but honesty, not combat skill but spiritual clarity. You could not deceive him with alert heart. You could not hide your true nature from a being whose sole purpose was to perceive the reality of your soul. What is remarkable, what perhaps strikes you most forcefully when contemplating these guardians, is the way they represent a kind of democratization of cosmic law. The gate guardians did not distinguish between peasant and pharaoh, between wealthy merchant and common labourer. The system did not work through bribery or privilege or social status. It worked through knowledge and preparation. A pharaoh who had neglected to learn the names of the guardians would be turned away just as readily as any other soul. Conversely, a common person who had dedicated themselves to study, who had memorized the sacred texts, who had participated in the rituals and gained the necessary knowledge, that person would pass through unobstructed, their soul recognized as worthy, regardless of their earthly station. For me, this aspect of Egyptian spirituality seems profoundly egalitarian in a way that many other religious systems were not. It suggests that the Egyptians understood something essential about justice and fairness, that true judgment cannot be corrupted by wealth or power or social status. The gates do not ask, "Who were you in life?" They ask, "What did you know? What did you prepare? What have you made of yourself?" This is judgment based on merit, on preparation, on the individual's actual spiritual development, rather than on external circumstances or the accident of birth. But there is another layer to this system, and this is where it becomes more complex and more troubling. because the knowledge of the guardians' names and the proper spells to pass the gates was not equally distributed throughout Egyptian society. It was concentrated in the priesthood. It was controlled by the scribes. It was accessible primarily to those with education, leisure time, and access to the sacred texts. A poor farmer living in a remote village might not have the resources to learn the necessary information. They might not have access to a priest who could teach them. They might not be able to afford a copy of the Book of the Dead or afford the prayers and spells that others could purchase or commission. This created a system where spiritual knowledge became, in effect, a commodity. The wealthy could afford better preparation. They could commission elaborate copies of funerary texts. They could pay for priests to perform longer and more detailed rituals. They could afford amulets inscribed with protective spells. And while the gate system itself was theoretically impartial, in practice the wealth of Egypt often translated into better preparation for the afterlife, which meant better chances of success. This is not unique to Egypt, of course. Many religions and spiritual systems have been subject to similar distortions, where spiritual truth becomes entangled with economic reality. But it is worth noting that the Egyptians were apparently aware of this problem and made efforts to address it. The spells contained in the Book of the Dead were meant to be accessible to all Egyptians, not just the wealthy. Priests would recite them for common people. Instructions were painted on coffins where the dead person could read them. The idea was that knowledge, properly shared, could grant access to salvation for anyone, regardless of means. The gate guardians also had another crucial function that we should not overlook. They were not merely obstacles to passage. They were also protectors. They defended the sacred space of the underworld against those who had no business being there. They prevented chaos from spilling through the gates. They maintained the boundaries between the living world and the realm of the dead. A soul that was not ready to become dead. A living person who tried to enter the underworld unprepared, a creature of pure chaos seeking to infiltrate the sacred realms. These would all be turned away or destroyed by the gate guardians. The guardians represented not just a test of knowledge, but a genuine barrier between incompatible states of being. And here we return to our earlier theme. The idea that the Egyptian cosmos required active maintenance, required participation, required constant effort to sustain. The gate guardians were part of this machinery. They were part of the system that kept creation functioning, by filtering access to the underworld, by ensuring that only the properly prepared could pass. The guardians maintained the integrity of the afterlife. They prevented it from becoming corrupted or polluted. They ensured that it remained a genuinely sacred space, not merely a dumping ground for all souls, worthy and unworthy alike. There is one more aspect of the gate guardians that deserves our attention, and this is perhaps the most mysterious aspect: the spells and magical words that could compel a guardian to grant passage. The Book of the Dead and the Book of Gates contain numerous examples of these spells, words of power designed to overcome or persuade the guardians. Some scholars have interpreted these spells as essentially magical passwords, specific combinations of words that would unlock each gate. Others have suggested that the spells were designed not to compel obedience from the guardians, but to demonstrate to the guardians that you possessed genuine magical knowledge and therefore could not be a false or unprepared soul. What is clear is that these spells were taken extremely seriously by the ancient Egyptians. They were not meant to be merely recited. They were meant to be internalized, to be understood at the deepest level, to be made part of your spiritual being. The act of learning and memorizing the spells was itself a spiritual practice. It was meditation. It was preparation. It was the soul being educated in the truths of the afterlife realm, so that when the time came, when death arrived, the soul would already be oriented in this landscape. It would already speak the language of the underworld. It would already understand the protocols and the procedures. For me, what strikes most powerfully about the Gate Guardian system is how it transforms death itself into a kind of examination, not a punishment, but a test that you had been preparing for your entire life. Every time you attended a religious ceremony, every time you heard the names of the guardians recited, every time you studied the Book of the Dead or participated in a ritual, you were studying for this exam. And unlike academic exams, unlike the tests of the living world, there would be no retakes, there would be no second chances. You would get one attempt to name the guardians, one opportunity to demonstrate your knowledge and worthiness. But you would have had your entire lifetime to prepare for that single moment. The Gate Guardians transform the moment of death into not an ending, but an evaluation, the culmination of all the spiritual work that had been done during life. The discovery of tomb decorations depicting these guardians has been extraordinarily enlightening. In the tomb of the general named Menakhebenekau, dating to the Sai'te period, researchers have found the gates depicted on the very walls of the tomb itself, 6 gates, each guarded by 3 demons, each meant to serve a dual function as markers of the spiritual journey the deceased would undertake, and as actual guardians of the tomb itself, preventing unwanted intrusion from the living world. The demons depicted there are remarkable in their specificity. One is a turtle-headed creature called Eater of His Own Excrement, a name so grotesque, so deliberately repulsive, that one is forced to consider what this particular guardian represented. Perhaps the consumption of one's own waste, one's own rejected refuse, represented the confrontation with shame, with the parts of oneself that one would prefer to deny or forget. To pass this guardian might require acknowledging these aspects of yourself, integrating them rather than attempting to deny or escape them. Another guardian depicted there is a lion-headed figure known as He with Alert Heart. The same type of sentinel we have already discussed, a being whose role is not to fight but to see, to judge, to recognize truth. Beside him stands a baboon demon called the Great One, a creature whose name speaks to immensity and power, but also perhaps to an animal nature, a reminder that humans are also animals, that we contain within ourselves the same base instincts and hungers as the creatures of creation. These guardians, standing at the gates, represent in many ways the full range of what the Egyptians understood about human nature and human development. They are not simply obstacles. They are teachers, they are mirrors, they are tests that are designed not to fail you, but to reveal the truth of who you are and what you have become through your life's choices. To stand before a gate guardian and be unable to speak its name is not a tragedy imposed by a cruel cosmos. It is a revelation that you did not take your spiritual development seriously, that you did not prepare yourself adequately for this inevitable moment, that you treated death as something distant and unimportant rather than as the culminating examination of your entire existence. The Lake of Fire, such a simple name for something so complex, so multifaceted in its horror and its purpose. Yet this is precisely what we must speak of now, for it stands as one of the most essential and most dangerous landmarks in the entire underworld. For you see, dreamers, the journey through the Duat is not merely a series of gates and guardians, though we have spoken of those at length. There are also places, regions, landmarks that exist not simply as obstacles but as entire worlds unto themselves. And among all such places, none is more feared, more spoken of in whispers among the common people of Egypt than the Lake of Fire. Imagine, if you will, a body of water, not the peaceful Nile that flows through Egypt, bringing life and fertility to the black soil each year, not the serene lakes depicted in tomb paintings where goddesses stand in contemplation. This is something fundamentally different. This is a rectangular expanse of water, and around its every edge burns flame. Not ordinary flame, mind you, not the kind you might create with wood and kindling. This is primordial fire, fire that burns without consuming its source, fire that gives off a heat so intense that the very air above the lake shimmers and distorts reality itself. Fire that has been burning since before creation took its current form and will continue burning long after the cosmos reaches its final hour. The waters of the lake of fire are not water as we understand it. The ancient texts describe them as simultaneously burning and liquid, as though the lake itself violates the fundamental laws of natural philosophy. Some scholars have suggested that the Egyptians were describing a kind of mirage effect, the way heat creates illusions in the desert, causing distant lakes to shimmer on the horizon that vanish as you approach. But to interpret it this way is to miss the point entirely. The lake of fire was not meant to be naturalistic, it was meant to be transgressive. It was meant to represent a space where the normal rules of creation do not apply, where matter behaves according to different laws, where what should be impossible becomes inevitable. Standing at the four corners of this lake, positioned so that they face outward, ever vigilant, ever watching, are four baboons. These are not ordinary baboons, you understand? These are divine creatures associated with Thoth himself, the god of wisdom and writing, the keeper of divine knowledge and the recorder of all that transpires. The baboons greet the rising sun each morning with their characteristic cries. Their voices are said to be the sound of creation recognizing itself, of the universe acknowledging its own existence moment by moment. But here, in the lake of fire, these same creatures serve a different purpose. They serve as guardians and judges. They are the enforcers of a terrible duality. For the lake of fire is perhaps the most perfect representation of the Egyptian understanding of moral consequence that exists anywhere in the underworld. It is not a place of random punishment. It is not a space designed by a cruel deity for the purpose of creating suffering. It is instead a manifestation of natural law, the law that states that every action has consequence, that every choice carries weight, that there is no neutral ground in the universe. The baboons understand this. They have studied it. They embody it. And when a soul approaches the lake of fire, the baboons judge whether that soul is worthy of safe passage or worthy of annihilation. If the soul has lived righteously, if the heart, when weighed against the feather of Ma'at, was found to be light and true, then the baboons recognize this. They see it written in the very essence of the soul. And should that soul approach the lake of fire, they do something remarkable. They do not block the passage. Instead, they part, and the waters of the lake, while still burning around the edges, create a pathway through the center. The flames seem to hold back, creating a corridor of water that is purifying rather than destructive. And as the righteous soul walks through this pathway, the heat of the flames cleanses away the last vestiges of earthly corruption. The fire refreshes rather than consumes. It purifies rather than destroys. The soul emerges from the lake of fire renewed, stronger, more fully prepared for what comes next in the journey toward eternity. But if the soul is unworthy, if it harbors lies, if it has committed terrible deeds, if the weight of its heart exceeds the weight of Ma'at's feather, then the baboon's demeanor changes entirely. They do not move. They do not create a pathway. Instead, they turn their gaze fully upon the approaching soul, and in that gaze is written an absolute refusal. The soul cannot pass between them. It cannot proceed forward, and if it attempts to do so, if in desperation or defiance it tries to cross the lake through the burning waters, then something terrible occurs. The fire does not simply consume the body of the soul, it consumes everything. It burns away the ba, the soul itself. It chars the ka, the life force. It obliterates the akh, the transformed spiritual state that should continue after death. The unworthy soul does not simply die. it ceases to exist entirely. This is the second death. This is the annihilation. This is the fate that the ancient Egyptians feared more than anything else. Tossed. Now, who tends this fire? Who maintains it? Who ensures that it continues to burn with precisely the right intensity to cleanse the worthy and consume the unworthy? This is where we must speak of the demons who dwell within the lake of fire itself. And here, dreamers, we encounter something both fascinating and disturbing about the Egyptian understanding of evil and punishment, because these demons are not agents of cruelty. They are not beings who enjoy causing suffering. They are functionaries. They are the maintenance crew of the cosmic punishment apparatus. They exist because someone has to do this work, and they do it with a kind of grim professionalism. Chief among these demons is a being called Ammit, a name that translates to devourer of millions or, in some texts, eater of eternity. Ammit is depicted as a man who bears the head of a hunting dog, a creature fierce and powerful, built for pursuit and capture. His eyes are described as burning coals. His teeth are said to be like sharpened flint. His entire form radiates an energy that is simultaneously predatory and purposeful. Unlike Ammit, who sits in the hall of judgment waiting to consume the unworthy hearts presented to her, Ammit actively hunts within the lake of fire. He roams the burning waters. He pursues those souls who attempt to cross without the proper knowledge or preparation. He is, in many ways, the embodiment of a more active form of judgment, not a passive executioner, but an active enforcer. What makes Ammit particularly fascinating is that he is not presented as evil in the moral sense. He is not depicted as taking pleasure in his work or as being sadistic. He is described as simply doing his function. The ancient Egyptians understood something that we, in the modern world, sometimes forget, that someone must perform unpleasant tasks. Someone must maintain order through enforcement. Someone must ensure that cosmic law is upheld, even when that enforcement involves destruction and annihilation. And Ammit accepted this role. He understood it. He carried it out with the dedication of one who knows that the work, however unpleasant, is necessary. Only the god Atum is said to possess the power to repel Ammit, to drive him back from his hunting. And Atum, the creator god himself, would use this power when Ra passed through, protecting the divine Barke from the worst of the demon's attention. But Ammit is not alone in the lake of fire. According to the most detailed texts that describe this region of the underworld, there are 7 beings who execute decrees within the lake. These 7 beings, known collectively as the 7 who cut and slay, possess terrible names that speak to their function. One is called He Who Cuts Off Heads. Another bears the title She Who Hacks Necks. A third is known as the Slaughterer of Hearts. These are not names of beings one wishes to encounter. These are names designed to strike terror into the heart of any soul who hears them. Yet each name carries information. Each name reveals the specific nature of the being's function. To know the name was to understand what the being did, and therefore to have at least some framework for comprehending how to potentially avoid that being's attention. The ancient Egyptians believed that knowledge of these 7 names was crucial for safe passage through the lake of fire. The spells contained in the Book of the Dead and the coffin texts include references to these beings by name, instructions on how to address them, and magical formulas that might convince them to allow passage. One spell, translated from the papyrus texts, essentially says something like this: I know you, 7 who execute decrees. I know your names. I know your functions. I come before you with a heart that has been weighed and found true. Grant me passage. To speak this spell with full understanding was to transform yourself in the presence of the 7. You were no longer simply a soul lost and confused in the underworld. You were someone who had studied, who had prepared, who possessed knowledge. You were, in a sense, initiating yourself into a club that had higher standards and stricter rules than any society in the land of the living. What strikes me most forcefully about this system is how it transforms knowledge into a kind of shield. In our modern world, we tend to think of safety in terms of physical protection or legal systems or institutional power. But the Egyptians understood that true safety comes from knowledge. They understood that understanding the nature of a threat, understanding it deeply enough to use its true name, gives you a form of power over it. Or at least, a form of immunity to the worst of its effects. This is why the scribes were so valued in Egyptian society. This is why education and literacy were so carefully guarded and controlled. Because the ability to read and write meant the ability to access sacred knowledge, and sacred knowledge meant the ability to navigate the afterlife successfully. Now, we must speak of something that the Egyptian texts mention with particular horror, the fate of those who are cast into the lake of fire without redemption. The texts describe cauldrons surrounding the lake, massive pots set upon stands with fires burning beneath them, and demons using long poles to stir the contents. Into these cauldrons are thrown not merely bodies but components of the soul itself, the ba, the ka, the akh, the shadow, the very memory of the person's existence. These components are cooked together, broken down, burned away, obliterated. The soul is not simply destroyed in the way a flame might consume wood. The soul is broken apart at its most fundamental level. Every component of existence, material, spiritual, psychological, is subjected to this ultimate dissolution. For the unworthy, there was no escape. There was no negotiation. There was no possibility of appeal or redemption. Once cast into the lake of fire, once subjected to the work of Ammit and the seven who execute decrees, the soul was finished. It would not emerge transformed as the righteous soul emerged. It would not continue to any paradise or field of reeds. It would simply cease. And the most terrifying aspect of this cessation was that it was absolute and eternal. The soul would not even continue in any form of torment. It would simply not exist. To the ancient Egyptian mind, this was worse than any torture, worse than any eternal punishment. It was the negation of existence itself. But here is where the system becomes beautifully, horrifyingly logical. The lake of fire was not designed as a punishment for the sake of punishment. It was designed as a filter. It was designed to ensure that only souls who had lived righteously, who had conducted themselves according to Ma'at, who had embodied truth and justice in their lives, would proceed to the eternal paradise. The lake of fire stood as the final test before access to the field of reeds, the final examination before entrance into eternal life. And in this way, every soul that made it through had earned it. Every soul that emerged from those burning waters purified and renewed had proven themselves worthy through their very passage. The baboons understood this deeply. They were not cruel judges imposing arbitrary punishment. They were keepers of a standard. And in their patient vigilance at the four corners of the lake, they represented the Egyptian conviction that the universe is fundamentally just, not in the sense of being kind or merciful, but just in the sense of being lawful, ordered, and fair. Your actions determine your fate. Your choices determine your destiny. The baboons did not judge. They merely recognized what had already been determined by how you had lived. There is one more aspect of the lake of fire that deserves our attention, and this is perhaps the most mysterious aspect. Some texts describe the lake of fire not as a single location, but as a series of lakes, multiple bodies of burning water positioned at different points along the soul's journey through the Duat. Each one corresponds to a different test, a different trial, a different aspect of the soul's preparation. The first lake tests courage, the second tests wisdom, the third tests the ability to distinguish truth from falsehood. By the time a soul has passed through all of them, by the time it has been tested and refined by each successive trial, it has been transformed. It has been purified not merely by fire, but by ordeal, by the necessity of maintaining righteousness and knowledge through increasingly severe challenges. This understanding reveals something profound about the Egyptian philosophy of growth and development. The Egyptians did not believe that a soul simply reached the afterlife in the state it had been living. They believed that the journey itself was transformative, that the trials themselves were not merely obstacles to be overcome, but teachers to be learned from, that every demon encountered, every fire endured, every test passed, contributed to the soul's ultimate refinement and preparation for eternal existence. The lake of fire was not simply a barrier, it was a crucible. It was the forge in which souls were tested, refined, and ultimately perfected or destroyed. There is a name spoken in whispers throughout the underworld, dreamers, a name that even the other gods invoke with a mixture of respect and dread. And that name belongs to Sekhmet the Powerful One, the Eye of Ra, the Lady of Pestilence, and also, paradoxically, the Lady of Life. She who is both destroyer and healer, both the bringer of death and the preventer of plague. But before we can truly understand Sekhmet and her role in the cosmos, we must speak of her messengers, for they are perhaps the most misunderstood and yet most essential beings operating within the framework of divine justice. Sekhmet herself does not dwell permanently in the Duat. She is primarily a force of the living world, the embodiment of Ra's wrath directed toward those who would violate Ma'at, toward those who would sow chaos and disorder in the lands of Egypt and beyond. She is the lioness who prowls the desert. She is the heat of the midday sun made manifest in divine form. She is the one whom Ra created specifically to enforce his will, to punish the disobedient, to ensure that cosmic law was not merely a theoretical concept, but an actual, lived reality that affected the lives and deaths of all creatures. But Sekhmet is not everywhere at once. Even a goddess of her immense power cannot be simultaneously in every location, witnessing every transgression, delivering every punishment, and so she does something that even the greatest gods must do: she delegates. She sends forth her messengers. And here, dreamers, we encounter one of the most fascinating and most terrible aspects of Egyptian cosmology: the understanding that authority flows downward through hierarchies of divine agents, that power is delegated and distributed, that cosmic law is enforced through chains of command that extend from the highest heavens down to the most remote corners of creation. Sekhmet possessed 7 messengers. 7. This number was not arbitrary. The Egyptians understood that 7 was a number of power and completeness. It appeared repeatedly in their cosmology. There were 7 gates through which the soul must pass in some descriptions of the afterlife. There were 7 forms of Ra. There were 7 sacred oils used in mummification. 7 was a number that contained within itself a kind of sacred multiplication of power. And so when Sekhmet sent forth her 7 messengers, she was not simply deploying servants. She was sending out 7 distinct manifestations of her will, 7 different ways in which her authority could be exercised in the world. 2. Who were these messengers? The ancient texts provide us with remarkably specific information about their nature. Sometimes they are described as being personifications of the arrows from Sekhmet's quiver arrows that do not simply wound the body, but carry within them the essence of plague, disease, suffering, and divine judgment. When you were struck by an arrow from Sekhmet's quiver, it was not merely a physical trauma. It was a spiritual attack, a direct intervention of divine forces into your life, a statement that you had somehow violated cosmic order and that Sekhmet herself had taken notice. Other texts describe the messengers as more creature-like in nature, beings that could move with supernatural speed, that could rush like the shadow of a body, as one ancient text poetically describes them. They were couriers, it seems, though couriers of a very particular and terrifying sort. They carried messages, yes, but the messages they carried were written in blood. They brought news of divine displeasure, but the news arrived in the form of plague, in the form of fever, in the form of sudden death. To see one of Sekhmet's messengers approaching was to know that judgment had been rendered, that your actions had been weighed and found wanting. And what were these actions that would draw the attention of Sekhmet's messengers? They were primarily transgressions against Ma'at, against cosmic order and divine law. If you violated the laws set forth by Ra and his appointed representatives on earth, if you betrayed your oaths, if you committed murder or theft or sorcery, if you treated the sacred with disrespect or failed in your duties to family and state, then you had placed yourself in opposition to the cosmic order itself. And when you opposed the cosmic order, you were implicitly challenging Ra himself. And when you challenged Ra, you opened yourself to the attention of his most direct and most terrible instrument of vengeance, Sekhmet and her messengers. But here is where the system becomes complex and where the role of Sekhmet's messengers becomes more nuanced than simple punishment. For Sekhmet was not merely a destroyer, she was also the goddess of medicine and healing. The priests of Sekhmet became known throughout Egypt as the most skilled physicians and healers in the land. This seems like a paradox. How could the goddess of plague also be the goddess of healing? How could the same deity who brought disease also cure it? Yet the answer reveals something profound about Egyptian philosophy. Sekhmet represented not cruelty, but balance. She maintained the equilibrium between life and death, health and disease, order and chaos. She was not evil, she was the enforcer of consequence. The messengers of Sekhmet operated within this same framework. They did not strike randomly. They did not bring plague to the innocent or the righteous. They targeted those who had earned divine punishment through their actions. If you had lived in accordance with Ma'at, if you had upheld the laws and honored the gods, then Sekhmet's messengers would pass you by. They might strike down your neighbor, they might bring suffering to those around you, but they would not touch you. This created a system where plague itself became a form of divine judgment, where disease and suffering were understood not as random misfortunes, but as consequences, sometimes deserved, sometimes not, but always meaningful in the context of cosmic order. There is a famous myth, one that appears in multiple forms across different Egyptian texts, that illustrates the power and the purpose of Sekhmet's messengers. In this myth, Ra had grown old and weak. Humans who lived on Earth began to lose their respect for him. They defied his laws. They stopped performing the rituals and offerings that maintained the cosmic order. They treated the divine with contempt. This angered Ra profoundly. He could not tolerate this violation of Ma'at, this destruction of the order that he himself had established. And so he sent forth Sekhmet, not in the form of the goddess herself, but in the form of Hathor, the beloved wife of Ra, transformed into the fierce, predatory form of the divine lioness. He sent her to earth to punish humanity for their transgressions. Sekhmet descended upon the earth with terrible fury. The fields of Egypt ran with human blood. The goddess waded through the carnage, drinking blood, consuming the flesh of those who had disrespected Ra. Her messengers fanned out across the land, carrying plague and suffering to every corner of creation. For a time it seemed that humanity would be completely annihilated, that Ra's punishment would be so severe that no mortal would survive to see another sunrise. But then something remarkable occurred. Ra, observing the scale of destruction, felt a moment of compassion. He realized that his vengeance, though justified by the transgression, was beginning to exceed the bounds of justice itself. He could not allow all of humanity to be destroyed. Some must survive, some must be allowed to continue. And so Ra devised a plan. He sent forth messengers of his own, swift messengers who could rush like the shadow of a body. These messengers travelled to the city of Elephantine, far to the south, where they gathered vast quantities of red ochre. This pigment was then ground into powder and mixed with barley beer, creating a liquid that was the colour of blood, human blood, freshly spilled. Ra had 7,000 jars of this mixture prepared, and he spread it across the paths where Sekhmet hunted. When the goddess came upon these jars, her bloodlust so intense that she could not distinguish between genuine human blood and this clever disguise, she began to drink. She consumed enormous quantities of the mixture, her body becoming intoxicated on the beer, her mind clouded by the alcohol. Eventually, her rampage slowed, her fury was tempered, and finally she collapsed into sleep. The bloodlust that had driven her to such terrible heights of violence finally sated. What I find most striking about this myth is not merely the cleverness of Ra's solution, though that is certainly part of it. What strikes me most forcefully is the underlying philosophy it reveals about the nature of divine punishment and divine mercy. Ra did not simply call off Sekhmet's attack. He did not command her to stop and expect obedience. Rather, he worked within the nature of Sekhmet herself, her hunger, her intoxication by blood, her capacity to be distracted and deceived. He used cunning rather than command. He used understanding rather than force. And in doing so, he preserved humanity not through negating justice, but through allowing justice to run its course before redirecting it. But now we must consider what role Sekhmet's messengers played in the broader structure of the underworld and the afterlife. For while Sekhmet herself was primarily a force of the living world, her messengers moved between realms. They carried their terrible messages not only to the living but also to the dead. If a soul had lived unrighteously, if it had violated Ma'at while alive and had somehow managed to evade detection in this life, the messengers of Sekhmet could find it even in the underworld. They could pursue a soul through the Duat. They could hound it from gate to gate. They could weaken it, tire it, reduce its strength so that when it finally faced Ammit at the scales of judgment, it would be diminished and broken. This is what makes the messengers so terrifying from the perspective of the ancient Egyptian understanding of death and judgment. The judgment of Ammit was not something you could escape simply by dying. The consequences of your actions in life did not end when your heart stopped beating. Death was not an escape from judgment, but rather a transition into a different form of judgment. Judgment that continued, that pursued you, that hunted you relentlessly through the corridors of the underworld. The messengers of Sekhmet represented this continuation of consequence beyond death. This understanding that cosmic law operated not merely during your lifetime but eternally. That you could never truly escape the ramifications of your choices. In some texts, the messengers are described as having the ability to transform. They could appear as beautiful women to seduce a soul into revealing its secrets. They could transform into fierce animals to drive a soul through the gates. They could become invisible, following just behind you, whispering doubts and fears, attempting to weaken your resolve. They were psychological as well as physical threats. To encounter one of Sekhmet's messengers was not merely to face external danger, but to confront the internalized consequences of your own actions, your own guilt, your own shame, your own knowledge of the wrongs you had committed. These became the weapons that the messengers wielded against you. Yet, and this is crucial to understanding the nuance of Egyptian spirituality, Sekhmet's messengers were not inherently evil. They were not malevolent forces seeking to cause suffering for its own sake. They were agents of justice. They were enforcers of law. For those who had lived righteously, the messengers held no terror. They would pass by without acknowledgement. They would direct their arrows toward others. They would seek out other prey. And in this way, the system maintained a kind of balance. The righteous were protected. The unrighteous were pursued. And the messenger became, in essence, a reflection of your own moral state. If you lived truly, the messenger became irrelevant to your existence. If you lived falsely, the messenger became your eternal nemesis. There were spells and protective incantations in the Book of the Dead specifically designed to ward off Sekhmet's messengers. These spells did not attempt to deny the existence of the messengers or to argue against the justice they represented. Rather, they attempted to demonstrate that the soul reciting them had lived in accordance with Ma'at, and therefore had nothing to fear from Sekhmet's agents. The spell would essentially say, "I know you, messenger of Sekhmet. I know your name and your nature, but I have lived truly. I have upheld Ma'at. Therefore, pass me by. Seek those who have violated cosmic order, not those who have maintained it." For me, what emerges from the mythology of Sekhmet's messengers is a profound understanding of accountability. In the Egyptian worldview, there was no hiding place. There was no place where wrongdoing could be concealed indefinitely. The messengers represented the inevitability of consequences, the understanding that every action sends ripples outward, that nothing occurs in isolation, that what you do affects the cosmic order, and the cosmic order notices and responds. It is a philosophy that combines personal accountability with cosmic responsibility. You are not merely accountable to other humans, you are accountable to the universe itself. The priests of Sekhmet understood this intimately. They served as healers and physicians, yes, but they were also seen as intermediaries between human society and divine justice. They could interpret the signs of plague. They could recognize when Sekhmet's attention had turned toward a particular community or individual. They could recommend purifications and rituals meant to turn aside divine wrath. But their primary function was not to negotiate with the messengers or to attempt to prevent their coming. Rather, it was to help the community maintain Ma'at, to ensure that plagues would not be sent in the first place because the people had upheld cosmic order. In some depictions, Sekhmet's messengers are shown as winged creatures, entities that can move between heaven and earth with ease, that are not bound by the normal limitations of physical form. This flying ability was not merely a physical characteristic. It represented their ability to operate across different realms of existence, to move between the living world and the underworld, to pursue a soul from the moment of death onward. There was nowhere you could hide from them if you had violated Ma'at. They could follow you through every gate, every chamber, every trial. They could be waiting for you at the moment of your judgment before Ammit. And yet, it is important to understand that the relationship between Sekhmet and her messengers was not one of subordination and resentment. Unlike some systems where lower entities might resent their position or seek to undermine their superiors, Sekhmet's messengers served gladly. They understood the justice of their function. They believed in Ma'at. They understood that maintaining cosmic order was the highest purpose, and if maintaining that order required carrying plague and suffering to the wicked, then that was a noble calling. They were not executioners resentfully performing an unpleasant duty. They were warriors in a cosmic battle, servants of a principle greater than themselves. The messengers of Sekhmet also had another role that we must not overlook. In times when Ra himself was threatened, when the cosmic order itself was under assault from forces of chaos, Sekhmet and her messengers could be called upon as defenders. They could turn their weapons outward, not toward humanity, but toward the forces that threatened creation itself. In myths describing Ra's nightly battle against Apophis, Sekhmet and her messengers are sometimes depicted as part of Ra's divine army, standing ready to defend the sun god against the serpent of chaos. In these moments, they were not instruments of punishment, but instruments of protection. They were the guardians of creation itself. This duality is perhaps the key to understanding Sekhmet and her messengers fully. They were not forces of mere destruction. They were not agents of arbitrary cruelty. They were, rather, forces of balance and maintenance, capable of destruction when necessary to maintain order, but equally capable of healing and protection when circumstances required it. To the modern mind, this seems paradoxical. But the Egyptians understood what we, in our more recent times, have often forgotten, that life and death, health and disease, creation and destruction are not opposites locked in eternal conflict. They are aspects of a single system. They are complementary forces that maintain universal balance. Sekhmet and her messengers embodied this understanding perfectly. When a plague struck an Egyptian city, the people did not simply view it as a random misfortune or a natural disaster. They understood it as a message. They asked themselves what they had done to attract Sekhmet's attention. What law had they violated? What offering had they failed to make? What aspect of Ma'at had they neglected? And this reflexive questioning, this constant examination of one's actions in light of cosmic order, served a function similar to conscience in other religious traditions. It created a system of internal accountability. It made you your own judge, your own messenger of Sekhmet. Because before Sekhmet's actual messengers arrived, you were already delivering her message to yourself through your own understanding of moral consequence. 2. But now we must descend deeper, dreamers, into the darkest and most densely populated regions of the Duat. For we have spoken of the great beings, Apophis and Ammit, the gate guardians with their terrible names, the lake of fire with its demons of execution. But the underworld is not populated only by such magnificent and fearful entities. It is rather teeming with countless lesser beings, a vast population of demonic entities that exist in the shadows and corridors, in the forgotten chambers and the spaces between spaces. And among these countless creatures, there are two categories that appear with particular frequency in the funerary texts and magical papyri, two groups whose names recur again and again in the spells meant to protect the living and the dead alike. They are called the head-eaters and the blood-drinkers, and while they lack the cosmic significance of Apophis or the judicial authority of Ammit, they are perhaps more immediately terrifying to an individual's soul, more intimately threatening to the journey through the afterlife. Consider first the sheer proliferation of these beings. The funerary texts are not merely filled with their names, they are glutted with them, packed so densely with references that the scribes who compiled the Book of the Dead seem almost unable to stop listing them. He who eats heads, she who devours forearms, the one who feeds on entrails, the gnawer of bones, the swallower of excrement, the consumer of refuse. The names go on and on, each one more grotesque than the last, each one specifying with awful precision what particular part of the human form, what particular component of human existence that specific demon sought to consume or corrupt. This was not merely artistic exaggeration or metaphorical language. The ancient Egyptians believed these were real beings, and they took the specificity of the names seriously because it meant something. It meant that different demons posed different threats, and that protection required understanding exactly which demon you were attempting to ward off. Who were these lesser demons? Where did they come from? The texts provide varying answers, and here again we see the complexity and sophistication of Egyptian thought. Some of these beings were created by the gods themselves, minor deities or supernatural entities fashioned specifically to maintain order in the underworld. But others, and perhaps this is most disturbing, were transformed souls. They were humans who had died, who had faced judgment before Ammit, and who had somehow escaped total obliteration. Perhaps their hearts were found wanting, perhaps they lacked the knowledge to navigate the gates, perhaps they had committed such terrible transgressions that they could not be allowed to reach the field of reeds. Yet for some reason, through magic, through the intervention of other beings, through a loophole in cosmic law, they had not been entirely consumed. Instead, they remained trapped in the underworld, their original nature so corrupted and twisted that they were no longer anything recognizable as human. They had become demons. They had become hungry, and their hunger drove them to prey upon other souls who entered the Duat, to seek compensation for their own damnation by causing damnation in others. This is a particularly horrifying concept when you contemplate it fully, dreamers. It means that the demons you encountered in the underworld might once have been like you. They might have been farmers or soldiers, priests or merchants, mothers or children. They had lived lives on earth. They had known the light of the sun and the taste of bread, but their crimes, their failings, their betrayal of Ma'at had been so severe that death itself had transformed them into something monstrous. And now they existed in a state of perpetual torment, not being destroyed, but also unable to find peace or rest. They were forced to exist in the spaces between, driven by hunger and rage and desperation, seeking always to consume, to drain, to feed on the essence of other souls in a futile attempt to fill the void that had been created by their own damnation. In a way, they were both victims and perpetrators, both the damned and the damnation itself. The physical forms of these lesser demons were remarkably varied, yet they followed certain patterns. Almost universally, they possessed hybrid bodies, human forms combined with animal heads, or occasionally more dramatic arrangements where the body itself became a composite of multiple creatures. These were not meant to be naturalistic or beautiful. They were meant to be disturbing. A demon might have the head of a crocodile mounted on human shoulders, its jaws still capable of snapping, its ancient reptilian intelligence focused entirely on predation. Another might wear the head of a hippopotamus, that massive, seemingly sluggish creature that could nonetheless move with terrifying speed when provoked. Some demons had the heads of jackals or hyenas or wild dogs, creatures associated with scavenging, with consuming the dead, with lurking at the edges of human civilization seeking scraps. A few possessed even stranger features, heads that faced backward, eyes positioned to see what lay behind them, mouths that opened impossibly wide or that contained rows of teeth like nothing found in nature. Some were depicted as double-headed, with two faces capable of perceiving threats from multiple directions simultaneously. And they were armed. This detail appears repeatedly in the artistic depictions. The demons were not merely creatures of hunger, but creatures equipped with tools of violence. They carried knives with blades that seemed to drink light. They wielded spears and pikes and lances. But most strangely, some were depicted holding creatures as weapons, snakes and lizards that writhed in their grasp, serpents that could strike with venom, creatures that could crawl and burrow and enter the body of an unwary soul. Others held plants as weapons, and these were no ordinary plants but magical vegetation, toxic things that could poison the spirit rather than merely the body. A few were shown wielding plants that resembled human organs, hearts and lungs and livers held aloft as weapons or as trophies taken from previous victims. The head-eaters seem to have represented a particular category among these lesser demons, those specifically focused on consumption and predation in its most literal sense. Unlike Ammit, who consumed hearts specifically in the context of judgment, the head-eaters sought to consume flesh. They sought to dismember. They sought to fragment the soul through physical violation. If the soul was caught by the head-eaters without proper protection, Without the knowledge of protective spells, it would be seized. It would be torn apart. Its component pieces would be devoured, and in the consumption, the soul would be destroyed or irreparably damaged. This was not the clean, swift judgment of Ammit. This was visceral, prolonged, agonizing. It was a fate that the ancient Egyptians genuinely feared because it suggested a kind of violent chaos at the heart of the underworld, a realm where the rules sometimes broke down and pure predatory hunger took over. The blood drinkers represented a different but equally terrifying threat. These demons focused specifically on the vital essence of the soul, the blood being understood as the carrier of life force, memory, and spiritual vitality. A blood drinker would pursue a soul not to consume its physical form, but to drain it, to extract the essence that made it alive and conscious. One such being bore the horrifying name Blood Drinker, who comes from the slaughterhouse, a name that suggests a creature that had developed its predatory practices in a place of organized death, a creature that understood the mechanics of extraction and preservation of vital fluids. What strikes me most profoundly about these lesser demons is how they represent a kind of spiritual ecology. Just as the physical world of ancient Egypt contained predators and prey, scavengers and hunters, so too did the spiritual world contain hierarchies of consumption. Ammit was the apex predator, the ultimate judgment. But below her, countless lesser beings hunted, fed, and preyed upon weaker souls. This created a system where the stakes of living righteously became not merely abstract, but viscerally immediate. If you lived badly, if you failed to prepare yourself, you did not simply face judgment from Ammit. You became prey. You became food for the countless predatory creatures that inhabited the darkness. Yet the ancient Egyptians did not see this as unjust. Rather, it was understood as natural consequence. You had lived as a predator in life, pursuing selfish gain at the expense of others, hunting for opportunities to enrich yourself through the suffering of others. Then in death, you would encounter predators. You would experience being hunted. You would feel the terror of prey. Your suffering would be proportional to the suffering you had caused. This was not revenge in the sense of malicious punishment. It was consequence. It was the universe maintaining its balance through the operation of impersonal law. Protection against these demons required knowledge of their names and the ability to recite protective spells with full understanding and conviction. The Book of the Dead contained dozens of such spells, each one designed to protect against a specific category of demon, or to address them directly in a way that would make them acknowledge the authority of the speaker. To recite such a spell successfully was to demonstrate that you possessed knowledge of the underworld, that you understood its structure and its inhabitants, and that you therefore had the right to pass through unmolested. A soul armed with such knowledge could walk through corridors filled with demons and not be touched, could pass through chambers where lesser demons hunted and yet remain unobserved. But now we must venture into territory that is perhaps more unsettling than anything we have yet encountered, dreamers, for we must speak of beings that occupy a peculiar and tragic position in the landscape of the afterlife. They are not demons in the strict sense. They were never created as servants of cosmic law or enforcers of divine will. They are, rather, the wronged dead. They are the Akhu who have been twisted and corrupted by circumstances, by violence, by the profound injustice of being denied the very rituals that would transform them into blessed spirits. And among all the threats that dwelt in the underworld, among all the terrors that a soul might encounter in the Duat, the vengeful Akhu are perhaps the most tragic and, in many ways, the most dangerous because their anger is personal. Their vengeance is born not from duty, but from wound. To understand the vengeful Akhu, we must first understand what the Akhu were meant to be, what they could become when all went according to the natural order. The Akhu, in their blessed form, were the transfigured dead, the glorified ancestors who had successfully navigated the trials of the underworld, whose hearts had been found light and true at the scales of judgment, who had entered into eternal life in the field of reeds. These were beings of immense power and influence, not demons or monsters, but genuine participants in the divine realm. They could intercede with the gods on behalf of their living descendants. They could provide protection and guidance. They could act as mediators between the living world and the divine sphere. They represented continuity, the bridge between past and future, the living memory of those who had come before. But this transformation, this elevation from mortal state to eternal Akhness, was not automatic. It required precise conditions. It required proper mummification, the careful preservation and rituals that would prepare the body to house the spiritual aspects of the deceased. It required the correct funerary spells, the knowledge contained in the Book of the Dead or the coffin texts, the magical words that would enable the soul to navigate the underworld safely. It required offerings made by living descendants, bread and beer left at the tomb, prayers spoken and maintained year after year. It required, in essence, the cooperation of the living on behalf of the dead. The Akhu were not independent beings who achieved their status and then existed in perfect autonomy. They remained, throughout eternity, dependent upon the living. They needed their offerings. They needed their prayers. They needed to be remembered. And here is where tragedy enters into the story. What happened when these conditions were not met? What became of a person who died without proper burial? What occurred when a soul died violently, suddenly, with no time for the proper preparation? What happened to those whose family lines died out, whose descendants abandoned the old ways, who were simply forgotten as generations passed? These were the conditions that created the vengeful Akhu. These were the circumstances that transformed what might have been blessed spirits into something twisted, angry, and dangerous. Consider the case of someone who died far from home, in a foreign land, with no family to retrieve their body, no priests to perform the mummification ritual, no temple to maintain their tomb. Their body might be left exposed to the desert or to the waters. The proper spells would never be spoken over them. No offerings would ever be made. They would exist in a kind of suspended state, neither truly living nor truly dead, neither having achieved the state of Akhu-ness that was their birthright, nor having descended into complete obliteration. They would remain trapped, conscious but powerless, aware of what they had lost and unable to accept it. Their anger in such a state would be beyond comprehension, not the anger of a being facing punishment for wickedness, but the rage of someone denied a right that was theirs by nature, stripped of their destiny through circumstance and misfortune. Or, consider someone who died violently, a murder victim perhaps, whose death was sudden and traumatic. The soul in such a case would be unprepared for the transition. There would be no time for the proper medications of the heart, no opportunity to achieve the spiritual readiness necessary for the journey through the Duat. Such a soul might wander, confused and terrified, not understanding what had happened, unable to find its way to the Hall of Judgment. It might become lost in the underworld, trapped in those dark corridors, surrounded by demons and hostile forces, with no knowledge of the spells that might protect it. And as time passed, years, decades, centuries, the confusion would transform into something darker. The fear would calcify into rage. The soul, understanding at last that it had been robbed of its natural destiny, that it would never achieve the Akhness that every human being deserved, would seek vengeance. It would seek to strike back at the living world that had abandoned it. This is the birth of the vengeful Akhu, and here is what makes them different from the demons we have previously discussed. The demons were created as part of the cosmic system. They had a function, a purpose, a role in maintaining order or in executing judgment. But the vengeful Akhu were not created by the gods. They were created by misfortune, by abandonment, by the failure of the living to honor their obligations to the dead. They were, in a very real sense, failures of the system, beings who should have been elevated to blessed status, but who had instead been corrupted by the very absence of the rituals that would have saved them. The power of a vengeful Akhu was immense, and this is what made them so feared in ancient Egyptian society. Unlike a demon, which was bound to the underworld and could threaten only those who entered that realm, a vengeful Akhu could return to the world of the living. It could cross the boundary between the Duat and the mortal world. It could manifest in the homes of those it held responsible for its condition. It could appear in dreams, that liminal space between sleeping and waking where the boundaries between worlds grew thin. It could cause nightmares so vivid that the dreamer would wake in terror, their heart racing, their body drenched in sweat, unable to recall what they had seen, but carrying the emotional residue of it. It could produce sensations of overwhelming guilt and shame. It could create inexplicable illnesses. It could drive people to madness. What I find most striking about the concept of the vengeful Akhu is how it represents a kind of cosmic accountability that transcends the boundaries of death itself. In the Egyptian worldview, you could not simply commit an injustice and escape consequences by dying. If you murdered someone and denied them proper burial, if you abandoned a family member to death in a foreign land, if you failed to maintain the tomb and offerings of an ancestor, these crimes did not end with death. The wronged spirit would pursue you. It would find you. It might not be able to harm you directly while you lived, but it could certainly make your life miserable. It could visit you in dreams. It could turn your family against you. It could cause you to sicken without medical cause. It could make your fields fail to yield crops. There are records, preserved on papyri and carved into tomb walls, of what are called letters to the dead, written communications from living people to the spirits of the deceased. Some of these letters are petitions, requests for the dead to intervene on behalf of the living, to use their supernatural power and influence with the gods to help with some difficulty. But others are something quite different. They are essentially legal complaints filed with the dead, describing injustices and demanding redress. They are communications with vengeful spirits, attempts to negotiate or to plead for mercy. One such letter, addressed to the spirit of a deceased wife, essentially says, "Why are you causing me such suffering? Why are you sending these illnesses to my children? I maintained your tomb. I made offerings. What wrong have I done to you?" The very existence of these letters reveals how real and how terrifying the threat of a vengeful Akhu was to ordinary Egyptians. The methods by which a vengeful Akhu could affect the living were numerous and varied. At the most direct level, it could appear to a person and threaten them. Such appearances were not necessarily violent or demonic in nature. A vengeful Akhu might appear in human form, much as the deceased had looked in life, and simply speak its complaint. "Why did you let me die unavenged? Why did you not retrieve my body? Why did you allow my tomb to fall into ruin?" These questions, spoken by a figure that seemed solid and real, speaking with the voice of someone the dreamer had known, could shake a person's entire being. The encounter might be remembered as vividly real even after waking, or it might exist in that ambiguous space where dream and reality blend. Was it real, or was it merely a nightmare? The uncertainty itself became a form of torment. Beyond direct appearances, a vengeful Akhu could manifest its displeasure through more subtle mechanisms. It could cause the living person to experience a deep and overwhelming sense of guilt and shame, feelings that seemed to arise from nowhere, that could not be explained or rationalized away. These feelings could be accompanied by a sense of being watched, of not being alone, of a presence in the room that was not quite visible but was nonetheless felt with absolute certainty. Some people reported hearing whispers, words spoken in a voice they recognized but could not quite make out, words that seemed to accuse and condemn. Others spoke of terrible luck. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Pottery that should not have broken shattered. Food that should have been fresh spoiled rapidly. Animals that were perfectly healthy suddenly sickened and died. A child who had been thriving began to waste away for no medical reason. These were all understood as potential signs of a vengeful Akhu's attention. What is remarkable is how the ancient Egyptians developed a kind of spiritual taught law to address these situations. If you believed yourself to be haunted by a vengeful Akhu, there were procedures you could follow. You could petition the spirit directly, acknowledging whatever wrong had been committed and promising to make amends. You could commission the creation of a new tomb or the restoration of an old one. You could arrange for offerings to be made regularly. You could hire a priest to perform rituals specifically designed to appease the angry spirit. These were not acts of mercy or charity. They were legal obligations, similar to paying compensation for a debt or an injury. They were the living acknowledging their responsibility toward the dead and attempting to fulfill it belatedly. Yet there was also a darker side to this system. If someone truly wished to harm another person, they could potentially exploit the fear of vengeful Akhu. They could hire magicians to perform rituals that would supposedly compel a deceased person's spirit to rise and haunt a particular enemy. They could leave letters at tombs addressed to the dead, describing some enemy and requesting that the spirit take vengeance on that person. Whether such magic actually worked or whether it was merely psychological manipulation is, perhaps, not the point. What mattered was that people believed it could work. They feared that their enemies might use such methods against them. And this fear was, in its own way, a form of power. Chet, the process by which a vengeful Akhu might eventually achieve peace, was complex and required the cooperation of the living. First, the wrong that had created the vengeance had to be acknowledged and, to whatever extent possible, corrected. The tomb had to be found or created. The body, if it had been exposed or abandoned, had to be recovered and properly mummified if possible, or at least properly buried. Offerings had to be made, rituals had to be performed, but more than this, the living had to genuinely understand the injustice that had been done and to feel genuine remorse. There are accounts in the historical record of how such situations were resolved. In one famous case, a man had apparently offended his son, and after his death his spirit began to torment the son with illnesses and bad fortune. The son, desperate, sought out a wise person, a priest or perhaps a magician, who advised him to write a letter to his father's spirit, explaining that he had meant no offense and requesting forgiveness. The son wrote the letter, placed it in his father's tomb, and apparently the hauntings ceased. Whether this was because the spirit was genuinely appeased, because the son's psychological state improved and he no longer imagined the torments, or because some combination of these factors occurred, we cannot know for certain. But the outcome was real enough. The suffering ended. I find myself contemplating what the vengeful Akhu represent in the larger context of Egyptian spirituality and thought. They are, in many ways, a reflection of the society's deep understanding of justice and obligation. They embody the principle that wrongs cannot simply be forgotten or swept aside, that abandoned and mistreated individuals, even in death, retain power. They cannot be silenced or made to disappear. Their injustice cries out from beyond the grave, demanding attention and redress. In this way, the vengeful Akhu served as a check on human cruelty and negligence. They made it impossible to treat the dead with complete disrespect without consequences. The nature of these spirits was fundamentally different from that of the demons we have previously discussed. A demon like Ammit was a cosmic force bound to the Duat, executing divine judgment. But a vengeful Akhu was a person, someone who had lived, who had been wronged, who retained individual identity and personal grievance. This is why they were more terrifying in some ways. You could not simply recite a spell learned from the Book of the Dead and expect it to work against a vengeful Akhu the way it might work against a generic demon. A vengeful spirit required personal negotiation, personal acknowledgement, personal redress. It required the living to take responsibility for their actions or their negligence. It required genuine change, not merely the recitation of magical formulas. And so, dreamers, we have journeyed through the landscape of the Duat together. We have encountered the terrible beings who dwell within it. We have witnessed the mechanisms of judgment and consequence. We have understood something of the cosmic architecture upon which the Egyptian afterlife was constructed. And yet, in understanding these individual pieces, we must not lose sight of the larger picture, the broader philosophy that animated all of these beliefs and gave them meaning. What emerges from a deep study of the Egyptian underworld is not a realm of random horror or capricious cruelty, but a cosmos governed by profound principles of order and justice. The gate guardians stood at their positions not to torment the worthy, but to filter, to separate those who had prepared themselves from those who had not. The lake of fire did not exist to destroy indiscriminately, but to refine and purify the righteous while consuming the unworthy. Sekhmet's messengers carried not malice, but consequence. The lesser demons hunted not out of evil, but out of hunger and the natural predatory order of existence. And even the vengeful Akhu, tragic as they were, represented something essential. The understanding that obligations to the dead cannot be abandoned, that wrongs echo into eternity, that justice transcends the boundary between life and death. The ancient Egyptians, in crafting this elaborate mythology and funerary practice, were not simply creating entertainment or passing down stories to amuse themselves around fires at night. They were constructing a moral framework. They were encoding into myth and ritual a philosophy that said, your life matters, your choices matter, your actions have weight and consequence that extend far beyond your own lifetime. You are not merely a temporary being living in isolation, affecting no one and affected by nothing. You are part of a vast cosmic system, accountable to it, dependent upon it, and responsible for maintaining it through how you live. This is why the Egyptian approach to death and the afterlife was so different from many other religious systems. There was no simple heaven waiting for all believers, no universal hell for the wicked. Instead, there was an examination, a judgment based on how you had actually lived. And this examination was not something to fear if you had lived truthfully, if you had upheld ma'at, if you had treated others with respect and maintained your obligations. For those who had lived righteously, the underworld was not a place of terror, but a place of transformation, a journey through which you were refined and perfected, cleansed of earthly corruption, elevated to a state of eternal blessed existence. But for those who had lived falsely, who had violated cosmic order, who had betrayed their obligations, for them the underworld was indeed terrible. They faced demons and judges and consequences that could not be negotiated with or escaped. They faced the truth of what they had become through their choices, and ultimately they faced obliteration, the second death, the cessation of all existence. Not as punishment imposed by a vengeful God, but as the natural result of imbalance, as the inevitable consequence of having aligned yourself with chaos rather than order, with untruth rather than ma'at. For me, What remains most striking about all of this is the way the Egyptians created a system in which accountability was built into the very fabric of existence. You could not escape through death. You could not hide from the consequences of your actions, but equally, you could not be judged unfairly or arbitrarily. The system was knowable. It was learnable. It was, in its own way, merciful, for it told you exactly what you needed to do to prepare yourself, exactly what knowledge you needed to acquire, exactly what behaviors and attitudes you needed to cultivate in order to ensure a successful passage through the underworld and into eternal peace. The night is long, dreamers, and the Duat stretches far beneath the world, vast and intricate, and filled with wonders and terrors that we have only begun to explore. The beings who dwell there, the great gods and the lesser demons, the gate guardians and the lake of fire, Sekhmet's messengers and the vengeful Akhu, all of them exist as part of a system that is fundamentally comprehensible. It is knowable. It can be understood. And in understanding it, the ancient Egyptians gave themselves something that many of us in the modern world have lost, a sense that the universe is ordered, that it operates according to principles that can be grasped, and that our individual actions matter in the context of that larger cosmic order. As you leave this place where we have walked together through the shadows of the underworld, remember this. The Egyptians did not invent these beliefs because they were pessimistic or morbid. They invented them because they were profoundly optimistic. They believed that the universe was just. They believed that virtue would be rewarded and vice would be punished, not in some distant and uncertain future, but inevitably as part of the nature of reality itself. They believed that preparation and knowledge could make you safe, that understanding could protect you, that how you lived mattered absolutely and eternally. The Duat will endure long after we are dust and memory. The gates will stand, the guardians will watch, the lake of fire will burn, the demons will hunt, and justice will continue to be weighed against the feather of truth. And perhaps, somewhere in the depths of your own soul, in the spaces where consciousness touches the eternal, you will understand something of this ancient wisdom. You will recognize that the choices you make now, the way you live now, the degree to which you embody truth and ma'at in your life, all of these things matter. They matter not merely to you or to those around you, but to the cosmos itself. They matter to the eternal balance between creation and chaos, between order and oblivion. This is the true teaching of the Duat, dreamers, not to fear death, but to understand that what you do in life echoes into infinity. Not to dread judgment, but to prepare yourself so thoroughly with knowledge and righteousness that judgment becomes not a terror, but a confirmation that you have lived well, that you have embodied truth, that you have earned your place in the eternal field of reeds. And so we close this chapter of our journey through the Egyptian underworld. But know that the Duat itself never closes. It waits eternally, a vast realm of transformation and trial, and ultimately for those who are worthy of transcendence. Thank you, dreamers, for walking with me through these shadowed corridors, for listening to these ancient stories, for allowing these truths to touch your consciousness. Until the next night, when once more we venture into mystery.